Chosen. 1. The community is outraged, demanding answers for what was done to you. The truth does not knock politely on the door of delusion. It does not wait in the foyer, and it certainly does not apologize for the disruption. Sometimes the truth simply kicks the door completely off the hinges, shatters the fragile windows of perception, and forces absolutely everyone in the room to stare at the undeniable wreckage they spent years desperately trying to conceal. Most people do not actually hate intelligence, authenticity, or divine alignment. What they violently despise is what your intelligence, your authenticity, and your profound alignment make them feel about their own deliberate mediocrity. Welcome to the reality of the spiritual battlefield. You are a chosen one. You are an individual who has been dragged through the subterranean depths of isolation, profound spiritual awakening, and brutal personal growth. You have survived the kind of invisible, agonizing wars that would completely shatter the minds of the highly performative people currently trying to critique you. Right now, you are navigating a bizarre, heavy, and confusing situation where insecure, toxic individuals are desperately trying to mimic your frequency or orchestrate your ultimate downfall. You have been gaslit, alienated, and painted as the villain in a narrative you did not even write. But a massive energetic shift has just occurred. The outrage you are sensing around you, the whispers in the community, the sudden, frantic meltdowns over your unapologetic success. This is not a coincidence. The people who secretly competed with you are exposing themselves in real time. Their carefully curated masks are violently slipping, and the audience they performed for is finally waking up and demanding answers. They are melting down not because you attacked them, but because your sheer existence, your unbreakable alignment, and your quiet elevation have rendered their manipulative script entirely useless. They built their entire identity around the assumption that you would stay at the bottom, and your ascension has triggered an absolute psychological and spiritual collapse. We are not going to skim the surface today. We are going to plunge into the subterranean mechanics of why these imitators behave the way they do, why their frantic pantomime looks so tragic from the outside, and what is truly happening behind their panicked, rapidly shifting eyes. Let us break down exactly why their empire of dirt is crumbling at your feet. Before we begin, I need you to do something. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, drop a comment with what point hit you hardest, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder. Let us get into it. Number 1. They never expected you to survive long enough to witness the expiration of their false narratives. You were supposed to break quietly in the corner where they left you. The entire psychological architecture of their betrayal relied entirely on your permanent, silent defeat. They calculated your destruction, assumed your forced isolation would breed madness, and bet everything on the arrogant assumption that you would simply fold under the crushing weight of their sabotage. But here you stand, breathing, evolving, and stepping into an era of untouchable, unbothered peace. Look closely at the devastating contrast between your internal alignment and their external performative charade. You spent your agonizing season of isolation doing the grueling, unglamorous work of internal excavation. You faced your darkest shadows, fortified your mind, and built an impenetrable internal citadel. They, on the exact opposite hand, stayed exclusively on the shallow surface. They operate from a borrowed, deeply insecure, highly performative framework that requires constant daily external validation just to keep their lungs breathing. They see your calm, but they do not understand the brutal resilience it took to forge it. They see your unshakable confidence, but they cannot fathom the bloody internal battles you had to win to achieve it. Why do they behave this way? It boils down to a terrifying, paralyzing fear of stagnation and a complete, catastrophic loss of control. Their fragile ego is entirely dependent on being universally perceived as superior. and they desperately needed you to permanently play the role of the tragic failure in order to successfully validate their own mediocrity. When you stubbornly refused to die in the narrative they so carefully wrote for you, their reality began to fracture. Metaphorically, watching them scramble right now is exactly like watching someone try to construct a massive skyscraper out of wet papier-mâché in the middle of a raging hurricane, while you are quietly, methodically stacking heavy, immovable bricks on solid, unshakable ground. They are frantically slapping cheap tape on a dissolving, rotting structure, acting like someone wearing heavy, ostentatious jewelry they cannot possibly afford. From the outside looking in, their behavior is incredibly goofy, deeply frantic, and undeniably tragic. They are pantomiming success while suffocating heavily under the accumulating debt of their own lies. They are spiritually and intellectually bankrupt, and your sheer, unapologetic survival is the ultimate blinding proof of their total insolvency. The community is demanding answers because they finally see the wet paper dissolving, and they realize you were the solid brick wall all along. Number 2, you force people to confront the authentic intelligence and the profound spiritual growth they deliberately abandoned for a cheap applause. There is a very specific, suffocating kind of agony reserved exclusively for those who sold their souls for a round of applause from an audience they do not even genuinely respect. When they look at you, they do not just see a person. They see a walking, breathing memorial of the integrity they cowardly compromised. You are authentic, hard-earned, and deeply anchored in a truth that absolutely does not bend to the temperature of the room. Your internal alignment dictates your precise movements, whereas their entire existence is a highly curated, exhausting performance designed solely to appease the lowest common denominator. They wear masks so frequently and so interchangeably that they have completely forgotten the original shape of their own faces. The deep subterranean psychology behind their visceral reaction to you is rooted in a profound, unshakable grief for their own lost, abandoned potential. When an imitator or a hidden hater looks at you, their incredibly fragile ego violently spasms because you remind them that it was actually possible to survive without selling out. It was possible to remain pure. It was possible to keep your mind completely intact. Their heavy reliance on a societal or communal script, a script that emphatically dictates you must compromise your morals to succeed, is entirely shattered by your absolute, stubborn refusal to follow it. They are utterly terrified of you because your existence proves that their painful compromises were completely unnecessary, meaning their tragic loss of self was for absolutely nothing. The metaphor here is stark and unavoidable. You are a roaring, uncontainable, massive bonfire, and they are a dim, battery-operated, cheap plastic candle pretending to cast real heat. They are desperately trying to warm themselves by the flickering light of their own artificiality, but they are freezing to death internally. It is a profoundly goofy, deeply tragic spectacle to witness someone parading around, desperately seeking validation from absolute strangers, while fundamentally despising the person they have to be in order to get it. They scramble frantically to diminish your light, because if your light is confirmed as real, their entire existence is immediately exposed as a cheap, flickering illusion. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. Your mere presence is the unforgiving mirror they have spent their entire lives running away from, and now the community has locked all the doors, meaning there is nowhere left for them to hide. Number 3. Their frantic mimicry is a desperate attempt to steal the harvest of a spiritual season they never actually sowed. We have all seen it, the sudden, eerie change in their vocabulary, the bizarre imitation of your personal style, the clumsy, transparent attempt to replicate your unique energy. They desperately want the gorgeous aesthetic of your ascension without ever enduring the brutal crucifixion of your preparation. You possess an authentic, hard-earned spiritual alignment that was forged in the agonizing fires of isolation, deep betrayal, and quiet, unbroken endurance. You faithfully watered your roots in the pitch black. In devastating, undeniable contrast, they are fundamentally insecure and externally validated, seeking only to violently copy the end result because they are entirely incapable of surviving the grueling process. They are the ultimate shameless spiritual plagiarists. The deep psychology behind this frantic imitation is a pathetic defense mechanism born out of a profound, paralyzing fear of absolute irrelevance. Their fragile, shattering egos simply cannot tolerate the uncomfortable fact that you naturally possess an organic magnetism that they cannot buy, fake, manipulate, or force. They rely heavily on the delusional script that success and spiritual depth are merely costumes one can quickly put on, rather than an intense, lifelong evolution one must undergo. When they blatantly mimic you, they are desperately, sweatingly trying to convince themselves and the observing world that they are on your exact level. But the energy always feels jarringly off. It feels completely hollow. Metaphorically, they are exactly like someone running frantically into a seasoned farmer's field in the middle of the dark night, stealing the fully grown crops and presenting them arrogantly at the morning market as their own hard work. But they do not know the soil. They do not know the agonizing weight of the seasons. They do not know the torrential rain. You are stacking heavy bricks on solid ground, while they are frantically stacking stolen, marked cards on a windy table. The frantic nature of their mimicry is deeply goofy because absolutely everybody, with even a single ounce of discerning spirit, can see the cheap seams of their stolen costume. They are wearing a crown made of brittle plastic, aggressively demanding to be treated like high royalty, while you carry the quiet, undeniable heavy gravity of someone who actually bled for the throne. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. The ultimate tragedy is that in their sick obsession to become a carbon copy of you, they have permanently and irrevocably forfeited the only opportunity to discover who they actually are. Number 4, they are violently triggered by your silence because they have always relied on your emotional chaos to extract their energy. In the past, they controlled you by meticulously pushing your hidden buttons, eliciting a massive reaction, and eagerly feeding off the subsequent drama. Your outrage was their premium fuel. Your frantic defense was their favorite entertainment. But you have drastically, permanently evolved. You have boldly stepped into a profound, chilling, unbreakable silence that they absolutely cannot penetrate. Your authentic internal architecture is now completely soundproof. You no longer explain, defend, or beg to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. You rest in an impenetrable alignment that requires absolutely no external defense. Contrast this majestic stillness with their highly performative, deeply chaotic, and externally dependent nature. They desperately need noise. They need constant swirling conflict to feel relevant, to feel powerful, and to validate their deeply insecure, crumbling facade. Without your emotional reaction, they are entirely starved of their primary narcissistic supply. The deep, dark psychology of their public meltdown over your silence is rooted in a terrifying, existential loss of control. When you do not react, you do not just deny them a simple argument. You fundamentally deny them their existence in your reality. Their fragile ego begins to cannibalize itself in the quiet. They are blindly following a script of provocation, and when you entirely refuse to read your designated lines, they are left standing completely alone on the stage, looking like absolute, unhinged fools. Metaphorically, Their erratic behavior is exactly like throwing tiny, insignificant pebbles at a reinforced, massive steel vault, and then screaming in sheer terror when the vault refuses to bleed. You are an immovable mountain, and they are a frantic, sweating tourist aggressively demanding the mountain move out of their way. It is profoundly tragic and utterly, undeniably hilarious to watch them rapidly escalate their pathetic antics, posting subliminal quotes, making passive-aggressive remarks, deploying flying monkeys, all in a desperate, sweating panic to get just one single drop of your energy. They are acting exactly like someone aggressively shaking a broken vending machine they never even put money into. Your absolute silence is a massive, highly polished mirror reflecting their utter powerlessness. And the more you remain totally unbothered, the more frantic, unhinged, and openly unraveled their performance becomes for the entire community to witness. They are actively drowning in the very silence you created to protect your peace. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. Number 5. They are realizing your value was never tied to your utility to them, completely exposing their cold, transactional nature. For the longest, most agonizing time, these toxic people operated under the absolute delusion that your worth was entirely dependent on what you could physically or emotionally provide for them. Your precious time, your infinite resources, your deep empathy, your brilliant light. They genuinely believed they were the ultimate directors of your self-worth. But your profound spiritual awakening violently flipped the script. You completely withdrew your access. You established an authentic, internally anchored, rock-solid self-worth that exists entirely independently of their selfish consumption. You realized that you are inherently valuable simply because you exist in divine alignment with the universe. Contrast this beautiful realization with their borrowed, insecure, heavily transactional identity. They only value other human beings as disposable tools, temporary stepping stones, or shiny mirrors used strictly to reflect their own grandiosity. They are entirely performative, using human relationships as cheap currency to buy fleeting external validation. The deep psychological terror they are experiencing right now stems from the absolute catastrophic collapse of their twisted worldview. Their fragile ego falsely told them that they were the massive blazing sun, and you were merely a tiny, insignificant planet trapped in their gravitational orbit. By violently breaking orbit and blazing your own trail, you definitively proved that they have absolutely zero gravitational pull. They are entirely terrified of their own stagnation, rapidly realizing that without your pristine energy to parasite off of, they have absolutely nothing left to consume but their own rotting toxicity. Metaphorically, they are exactly like a bloated tick that has finally fallen off a healthy host, suddenly and terrifyingly realizing it does not possess the organs to generate its own life force. You are a massive, self-sustaining, thriving ecosystem. They are a crumbling, abandoned, desperate parasite frantically looking for a new host. Watching them slowly realize that you absolutely do not need them, that you are thriving and expanding without them, is a masterclass in watching an inflated ego completely disintegrate. They scramble to devalue you to others, desperately trying to convince the outraged community that the gorgeous grapes they can no longer reach are simply sour. But it looks so incredibly, painfully goofy. They look exactly like a fired, disgruntled employee standing outside the building, screaming at the top of their lungs that the company is going to fail, while inside, the profits are soaring and the environment has never been more incredibly peaceful. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. Number 6. The sudden outrage from the community is merely the mirror reflecting the exact moment their carefully constructed mask finally slipped. You are currently witnessing the collective, explosive realization of a truth you have silently carried in deep isolation for a very long time. For years, you held the incredibly uncomfortable, heavy knowledge of who these people truly were behind closed, locked doors. You bore the absolute brunt of their sophisticated manipulation while they happily paraded around as flawless saints in the public square. But true spiritual alignment and absolute divine timing have an undefeated way of violently balancing the scales. Your authentic, hard-earned, quiet peace stands in stark, unavoidable, glaring contrast to their frantic, sweating, disorganized attempts to keep their false narrative alive. They have been running a massive psychological Ponzi scheme, aggressively borrowing credibility from one person simply to manipulate another. Now, the community is demanding strict answers, because the glaring inconsistencies in their performative facade have become mathematically and logically impossible to ignore. The deep subterranean psychology here is fascinating. The imitator is experiencing the ultimate catastrophic collapse of their false self. Their highly fragile ego is violently cracking under the immense weight of 1,000 tiny, undeniable observations made by the people around them. They relied heavily on a predictable script where they were the perpetually innocent, chronically victimized saint, but the math is absolutely not mathing anymore. Their deepest, darkest fear of being publicly exposed has successfully manifested the exact exposure they dreaded. Metaphorically, this is the exact horrifying moment the bright theater lights unexpectedly turn on in the middle of their dramatic, tear-filled monologue. Everyone in the audience can suddenly, clearly see the cheap cardboard props, the heavy smeared makeup, and the highly visible strings attached to their frantic limbs. You are sitting quietly and comfortably in the back of the audience, watching the entire pantomime unravel. The frenzy they currently display, trying desperately to silence the outrage, deploying sloppy damage control, violently blaming everyone but themselves, is exactly like watching someone try to frantically catch a waterfall with a tiny, rusted sieve. It is a frantic, exhausting, and thoroughly goofy display of a person realizing that their entire reputation, built on a crumbling foundation of lies, is being aggressively foreclosed on. They are intellectually, morally, and spiritually bankrupt, and the outraged community has finally come to collect the massive debt. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. Number 7. They fundamentally mistook your kindness for weakness, and your newly established boundaries have completely shattered their delusional sense of superiority. Empathy, in the hands and heart of a chosen one, is an absolute superpower. It is deep, resonant, boundless, and wildly generous. But highly toxic, deeply insecure individuals view empathy not as a beautiful gift to be cherished, but as a glaring vulnerability to be ruthlessly exploited. They arrogantly assumed your previous willingness to forgive, to constantly accommodate, and to exhaust yourself keeping the peace meant you entirely lacked a spine. They foolishly confused your profound grace with a lack of heavy gravity. But you underwent a massive, permanent internal shift. You perfectly aligned your deep kindness with fierce self-respect, successfully forging boundaries made of impenetrable titanium. You are now authentic, deeply anchored, and fiercely, unapologetically protective of your energetic perimeter. In incredibly sharp, devastating contrast, they operate from a place of chronic, unearned entitlement and highly performative dominance. Their entire fragile sense of self is externally validated by how easily they believe they can step on others to artificially elevate themselves. When they sprinted headfirst into the solid, immovable concrete wall of your new boundaries, the psychological recoil was absolutely devastating to them. The specific reason they act so aggrieved, so dramatically wounded by your reasonable boundaries, is because their fragile ego literally cannot compute the word no from someone they arrogantly viewed as permanently subservient. They deeply fear their own profound insignificance, and their heavy reliance on a script of unquestioned, tyrannical dominance is entirely destroyed by your quiet, unshakable refusal to submit. They feel completely and utterly out of control. Metaphorically, they are exactly like a reckless, drunk driver who has been comfortably speeding through a quiet, peaceful neighborhood for years, only to suddenly crash headfirst at 80 miles an hour into a newly erected, massive steel barricade. They are furiously screaming at the barricade for existing, entirely ignoring the absolute fact that they were driving wildly out of bounds. Watching them dramatically nurse their bruised, inflated ego is tragically comedic. They run around the community crying about how cruel and unforgiving you have suddenly become, acting exactly like someone wearing a cheap Halloween crown, aggressively demanding access to a kingdom that was never theirs to rule. Your boundaries did not make you bitter, they made you beautifully impenetrable, and to a starving parasite, an impenetrable host is the ultimate unforgiving offense. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. Number 8. You completely dismantled the artificial hierarchy they relied on by simply choosing to step out of their invisible competition. Society, and particularly highly toxic social circles, heavily operate on a subterranean, unspoken ranking system. Who is doing better? Who has more exclusive access? Who is the most publicly validated? These deeply insecure individuals live and die by this ridiculous hierarchy. Their entire performative existence is aggressively dedicated to climbing a shaky ladder resting against the entirely wrong wall. They desperately needed you to stay in the race so they could continuously measure their manufactured speed against your authentic pace. But you did something completely radical and highly terrifying. You did not just run faster, you left the dusty track entirely. You built a massive internal architecture that absolutely does not require any form of external comparison to thrive. You found an authentic, unshakable alignment that makes their petty external hierarchies look deeply ridiculous and profoundly immature. Contrast your quiet, singular, beautiful focus with their desperate, sweating, hyperventilating need to be perceived as winning. The dark psychology behind their absolute, unyielding obsession with you post-departure is rooted in a terrifying existential realization. If you genuinely do not care about the game might not actually matter. By completely refusing to compete, you entirely invalidate the very currency they spend their miserable lives hoarding. Their fragile ego heavily relies on a scripted delusion where absolutely everybody wants what they have. When you look at their cheap prizes and feel nothing but profound, absolute indifference, it induces a psychological free-fall of epic proportions. Metaphorically, they are playing a frantic, highly aggressive game of Monopoly, stealing from the bank, flipping the board, screaming at the top of their lungs about their paper wealth, while you have quietly, calmly walked out the front door to build a massive, real house on real, solid land. They are aggressively acting like monarchs of a tiny, dirty sandbox, completely unaware that you have entirely outgrown the playground. It is a deeply goofy, incredibly embarrassing spectacle. They keep sending you desperate subliminals, flying monkeys, and loud updates about their microscopic wins, frantically hoping to spark your jealousy. They are sweating, stacking cards on a windy table, praying you will look, while you are stacking heavy bricks in total silence, completely unimpressed by their frantic, empty, highly performative theater. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. Number 9. Their obsessive smear campaigns are actually dark confessions in disguise, projecting the internal rotting of their own character onto your clean slate. When the community is deeply outraged and fiercely demanding answers, you must look very closely at what the toxic individuals are actually saying about you. Every single lie they tell, every wild accusation they hurl into the void, is a highly detailed psychological autopsy of their own deeply corrupted soul. They accuse you of being manipulative specifically because they must tightly orchestrate every single interaction to survive. They accuse you of being jealous because they are completely suffocating under the crushing weight of their own toxic envy. They accuse you of being fake because they have not had a single authentic thought in over a decade. You possess a hard-earned, unshakable internal alignment that acts as a blank, brilliantly illuminated screen. They are entirely performative, existing as a frantic projector filled with dark, unresolved, and highly insecure film. The deep, subterranean psychology of a smear campaign is not simply about destroying your pristine reputation. It is a desperate, frantic, sweating attempt to offload their own unbearable, crushing shame. Their ego is so extraordinarily fragile that it literally cannot metabolize its own toxicity. They fear the stagnation and darkness within themselves so intensely that they must assign it to a surrogate. You entirely refused the script, so they try to force you into the role of the villain simply to excuse their own demonic, highly abusive behavior. Metaphorically, it is exactly like watching someone heavily smeared in foul-smelling mud, frantically trying to wipe their dirty hands on your pristine, bright white coat, screaming at the top of their lungs that you are the dirty one. It is deeply tragic because absolutely anyone with a modicum of spiritual discernment can see exactly what is happening in real time. The frantic energy they expend calling everyone, setting up false narratives, and running a clandestine, highly organized PR campaign against you looks incredibly goofy to the awakened observer. They are loudly, publicly confessing their own darkest sins and lazily slapping your name on the police report. You remain completely clean, entirely unbothered, quietly observing as their own toxic venom slowly, inevitably poisons the very well they must drink from. The community demands answers because they finally realize the mud is entirely on the accuser's hands. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. Number 10. They are realizing in real time that they cannot manufacture, buy, or steal the spiritual anointing that you carry so organically. This is perhaps the most painful, completely devastating realization for the highly performative, externally validated individual. We live in a superficial culture that actively teaches people they can simply buy the aesthetic of absolutely anything. You can buy the expensive clothes, learn the complex vocabulary, curate the perfect social media feed, and completely fake the lifestyle. But you absolutely cannot fake the divine anointing. You cannot put a cheap Instagram filter on profound spiritual gravity. You carry an authentic, deeply anchored, heavy resonance that instantly alters the frequency of the rooms you walk into. People naturally feel safe around you. People feel genuinely seen around you. This brilliant aura was forged in the absolute dark through brutal internal architecture and unwavering, agonizing alignment with pure truth. The imitators, in sharp, devastating contrast, are entirely hollow. They wear the intricate costumes of spiritual depth, but actually possess the emotional maturity of a shallow puddle. The deep psychology behind their frantic, obsessive behavior is a visceral, panic-inducing reaction to their own total spiritual impotence. They are watching you attract organic love, massive respect, and unbelievable elevation, and their fragile ego is violently shattering because they know their bank account and their sophisticated manipulation tactics absolutely cannot purchase what you naturally have. They are utterly terrified of their own echoing emptiness. They relied on a completely false script that said, "Fake it until you make it," but they are brutally discovering that in the realm of true energy, faking it just exposes you as a massive fraud. Metaphorically, they are exactly like someone confidently standing next to a roaring, natural, massive waterfall, trying to impress the massive crowd by violently shaking a tiny plastic bottle of lukewarm tap water. It is a profoundly embarrassing, deeply tragic display of total spiritual poverty. They are wearing heavy jewelry they cannot afford, parading around while their soul is absolutely, undeniably bankrupt. Their frantic, sweating attempts to outshine your natural, God-given anointing with their artificial, manufactured hype only serve to brightly highlight the devastating, unfixable lack of depth in their own spirit, completely outraging the community that finally sees the truth. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. Number 11. Your mere presence has become a walking, breathing audit of their life choices, their compromised morals, and their unresolved trauma. You absolutely do not have to say a single word to deeply, irreparably offend these highly toxic people. You do not have to critique them, gently correct them, or even acknowledge their physical existence. Your mere presence in a state of high vibrational alignment is more than enough to send them into a violent psychological tailspin. You represent the hard-earned, unshakable peace that only comes from doing the brutal internal work. You took absolute accountability, you deeply healed, and you painstakingly rebuilt your internal architecture on a foundation of unshakable, pure truth. Contrast this brilliant reality with their heavily guarded, deeply performative, and profoundly insecure existence. They have spent their entire lives running frantically from their trauma, burying their immense guilt, and constructing an elaborate, highly fragile facade to avoid taking any accountability for the massive wreckage they consistently leave behind. The deep psychology of their intense hatred for you is firmly rooted in the fact that your brilliant light casts a massive, undeniable, terrifying shadow over their carefully hidden secrets. You naturally trigger an involuntary, painful life audit within them. When they look at your profound peace, their fragile ego is brutally forced to recognize their own internal raging war. They rely entirely on a script of collective delusion, surrounding themselves with a massive army of enablers who all agree not to look too closely at the rot. Your absolute refusal to participate in that sick delusion shatters their entire sense of safety. Metaphorically, they are living in a completely dark house filled with rotting garbage, keeping the blinds permanently shut so they can pretend it is a pristine mansion. You are the person who walks in and simply, quietly opens the blinds, letting the blinding, unforgiving sunlight hit the absolute filth. You did not put the rotting garbage there, but they violently hate you for bringing the sun into the room. It is deeply goofy, utterly frantic, and completely tragic to watch them scramble, sweating profusely, to pull the blinds back down, screaming at the light instead of picking up a broom. They would rather fiercely attack the auditor than fix the absolutely catastrophic state of their own spiritual finances. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. Number 12. They scramble so frantically for external validation because they are absolutely terrified of sitting alone in the quiet of their own minds. Isolation is the ultimate unforgiving test of a person's true internal architecture. You know this deeply, profoundly, and intimately. As a chosen one, you were forcefully exiled into the terrifying wilderness. You sat in the deafening, crushing silence, faced your absolute worst demons, and emerged with an authentic, unbreakable peace that absolutely does not require an audience to exist. You are deeply, internally validated. You can sit in a completely empty, silent room and feel entirely whole and powerful. Now, contrast that staggering emotional independence with the frantic, sweat-inducing, hyperventilating reality of the toxic people desperately trying to bring you down. They are profoundly, terrifyingly hollow. Their entire identity is a messy amalgamation of other people's fleeting opinions. If they are not being actively praised, feared, or talked about, they literally feel as though their physical bodies cease to exist. The deep psychological engine driving their manic, obsessive behavior is a borderline phobic, paralyzing fear of their own internal void. Their fragile ego simply cannot survive without a constant, heavy IV drip of external validation. When they are entirely alone, without a script to read from or a captive audience to manipulate, the silence becomes a brutal torture chamber echoing loudly with their own deep insecurities and massive failures. Metaphorically, they are exactly like an old broken radio that only works if someone else is constantly holding and turning the dial. The exact moment the hands leave, it emits absolutely nothing but harsh, agonizing, unbearable static. You, on the absolute other hand, are a finely tuned, magnificent instrument, playing your own profound, beautiful melody. Watching them desperately perform is deeply tragic. They jump frantically from drama to drama, relationship to relationship, desperately stacking flimsy cards on a windy table just to stay distracted from the horrifying fact that they have absolutely no foundation. Their frantic need to be seen, to be right, and to be publicly validated is a goofy, exhausting dance of extreme avoidance, proving to the entire outraged community that they are absolutely terrified of the stranger living inside their own skin. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. Number 13. You represent the exact timeline and the exact quantum leap they could have experienced if they had chosen spiritual courage over comfortable conformity. Deep down, beneath the thick, suffocating layers of their malice and their highly performative arrogance, lies a very quiet, very devastating, undeniable truth. They know exactly what they traded away. At some pivotal point in their journey, they were presented with the exact same difficult crossroads you faced. They had the beautiful opportunity to choose raw authenticity, to do the grueling internal work, and to face the temporary agonizing pain of massive growth. But they cowardly chose comfort. They actively chose the easy lie, the cheap validation, and the familiar, warm toxicity. You bravely chose the hard truth. You fully embraced the terrifying isolation, allowed the intense fire to severely refine you, and emerged with an internal architecture built to withstand the ages. The deep subterranean psychology behind their absolute, unhinged obsession with your trajectory is entirely rooted in a profound, suffocating grief for their own completely abandoned potential. Their fragile ego is constantly, exhaustingly trying to manage the severe cognitive dissonance between where they currently are and where they know they could have been. You are the living, breathing, undeniable manifestation of their alternative timeline. You are the haunting ghost of their unlived courage. They rely heavily on the toxic script that the journey you took is entirely impossible, that absolutely everyone sells out, that nobody is actually pure. Your mere existence completely destroys that pathetic cope. Metaphorically, they are proudly standing in a stagnant, rotting, muddy puddle, violently insisting it is the vast ocean, while watching you effortlessly, beautifully sail across the actual open sea. It is a deeply frantic, thoroughly tragic disposition. They loudly mock your ship. They try to throw tiny rocks at your massive sails, and they desperately try to convince the onlookers that your magnificent voyage is doomed. They act exactly like someone wearing a cheap, tattered synthetic coat, laughing hysterically at the person wearing tailored, flawless silk, completely unaware of how incredibly goofy their envy looks to everyone watching. Your unshakable courage is the ultimate, unforgiving indictment of their absolute cowardice, and the community is demanding answers for their bitterness. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. Number 14. The final crushing realization is that no matter what external monuments they build to rival you, their internal world will always feel profoundly empty. This is the absolute endgame of the imitator. They will completely exhaust themselves trying to forcefully match your effortless external output. They will buy the expensive things, secure the hollow titles, aggressively manipulate the right social circles, and meticulously curate a massive, superficial empire designed specifically to make you feel small. But here is the magnificent, unapologetic, brutal truth of the chosen one. Your empire is entirely beautifully internal. You have achieved an authentic, unshakable spiritual alignment that makes worldly, petty competition completely irrelevant to your existence. You are deeply, profoundly satisfied with your own soul. In devastating, undeniable contrast, they are utterly trapped in a frantic, performative loop, desperately hoping that the very next external acquisition will finally plug the massive bleeding hole in their spirit. The deep psychology of their tragic existence is a complete, fundamental misunderstanding of spiritual mechanics. They arrogantly believe peace is something you conquer and capture, rather than something you patiently cultivate and become. Their fragile ego, absolutely terrified of irrelevance, forces them to keep building higher and higher paper towers, desperately hoping the altitude will cure their terminal internal sickness. They rely heavily on a script where external dominance magically equals internal peace, but the heavy math always fails them. Metaphorically, it is the exact difference between you carefully tending to a lush, deeply rooted, quiet garden and them frantically, sweatingly painting the dead leaves on a plastic tree, praying to God no one notices the overpowering smell of cheap glue. They are wearing a heavy costume of victory while suffering the agonizing, silent, completely crushing defeat of a totally barren soul. It is profoundly tragic, it is highly frantic, and it is the ultimate, inescapable punishment for their abusive behavior. They will spend their entire exhausting lives aggressively trying to convince the world they are better than you, only to lay their head on their pillow every single night and be utterly crushed by the inescapable, agonizing weight of their own absolute emptiness. The community is outraged, demanding answers because the plastic tree is finally falling over. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. When you zoom out and deeply look at the absolute totality of this highly complex dynamic, one staggering, undeniable truth becomes completely impossible to ignore. None of this was ever truly about your physical actions, your money, or your tangible, worldly success. The community's sudden outrage, the imitators' frantic public meltdowns, and the obsessive, calculating smear campaigns are all desperate, flailing responses to exactly one thing: your energy, your profound alignment, your unbreakable, unshakable internal architecture. They are aggressively attacking the invisible specifically because the invisible is exactly what they completely, tragically lack. They are entirely bankrupt of spirit, and your beautifully overflowing cup is a constant, agonizing reminder of their absolute, unending thirst. You absolutely do not need to drop down to their subterranean level to defend your honor. You do not need to explain your hard-earned peace to people who are entirely, aggressively committed to misunderstanding you. You do not need to perform, seek petty revenge, or waste a single breath trying to correct the narrative of a rapidly crumbling paper kingdom. The absolute best revenge, the absolute highest form of spiritual warfare, is your continued, uninterrupted, unapologetic joy. Let them completely exhaust themselves, running a frantic race you are not even registered in. Keep building your massive internal citadel. Keep honoring your authentic, undeniable frequency. Keep letting the blinding, pure light of your truth effortlessly expose the deep shadows of absolutely anyone foolish enough to stand in your way. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, drop a comment with what point hit you hardest, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder. Stay chosen, stay blessed.